I want to begin by reading something to you. I was trying to figure out at what point in the weekend that I would read this, and I landed on reading it tonight. Before I say anything else, I wanted to read you this. I have been now for the last 10 months or so writing a book. I haven't written a book since 2014. Before that, I wrote a handful of books, but haven't written one in a long, long time. My life went off the rails, and book writing came to a screeching halt. And I always felt like that was a part of my calling. It was a part of what God had wired me to do. It's something I enjoy doing some of the time, actually most of the time. But I felt like I really wanted to write a probing, transparent, brutally honest book about the last 8 years of my life. And so I've been working on it, and I think I'm probably about 2, maybe 3 weeks away from finishing it. And then it goes to my agent, and he will then shop it to a publisher. But there's something in it that I wrote this week that I want to read to you guys, because I think it's super appropriate given the fact that we're having a conference here. I titled this section, Who Cares? All the things, I am not going to make it through this without weeping, so bear with me, please. I don't know if it's because I'm now 50 and I'm hormonally imbalanced, but I find myself crying a lot these days, a lot. I was flying to Jackson, Mississippi a few weeks ago, and I texted Stacy when I landed, and she said, how's the trip so far? And I said, it's good, but I've been crying the entire time, and I don't know why. Anyway, but writing this book has really been incredibly healing for me. It's been cathartic in a very probing way. So here we go. All the things I'd relied on to live, that's what I lost and was losing. One of those things, as odd as it may sound, was my religion. Losing that thing changed me for the better. The church I was a part of in Orlando after I resigned from Coral Ridge in 2015 due to infidelity was called Willow Creek Presbyterian. They hosted a conference on President's Day weekend in February 2016. This is President's Day weekend, you know. That was the same weekend that we held the Liberate Conference each year from 2011 to 2015, which was a large conference we hosted in Fort Lauderdale. Liberate shut down when I resigned from Coral Ridge. The Liberate Conference had been a rallying point, a gathering spot for thousands of people from all over the world who traveled to Fort Lauderdale once a year because they craved the message of grace that we were devoted to delivering. And now it was gone. There were many who clamored for something similar, so the plan was to get some version of the Liberate Conference back up and running by 2017. The 2016 conference at Willow Creek was supposed to be a placeholder conference until Liberate came back the following year. The same speakers that I used to bring in for Liberate were brought in for this conference. And while it was wisely decided that I would not be a main speaker, too soon, bad optics, the organizers wanted me to use whatever influence I had left to promote the conference and be visibly present at the conference. So I did agree to sit on a panel with the other speakers, all close friends of mine at the time. And I underline at the time, okay? All close friends of mine at the time. And have a theological discussion about grace and its related subjects. I'd honestly looked forward to the experience, having the opportunity to speak in a public setting once again while surrounded by people who knew me, people who were my allies. I was looking forward to it. But while they knew me, they also didn't. They didn't have a clue as to how desperate I felt on the stage that day. Surrounded by people, all eyes on me, but feeling totally alone. I was putting on a brave face, one of those simply to thy cross I'll cling faces, but it was nothing more than a facade. My divorce had just been finalized. My family was now irreparably broken. I missed the wife of my youth. I missed my kids. I missed our family the way it had been for 2 decades. I missed the life we'd had together, the life I'd taken for granted, the full life that I'd squandered. I felt internally and externally shipwrecked. I didn't have the strength to cling to anything, and some days that included the desire to keep on. You wouldn't believe the number of suicidal thoughts I had during that time, something I would have never believed I could ever even entertain. But I did almost daily. Yet there I was on a spotlit stage to talk about grace. The moment that stands out in that memory happened in the middle of a very robust academic discussion on that panel where big words like sanctification and justification and imputation filled the stage, important words that I very much believe in then and now. I had facilitated discussions like this and thrived in them many times before. I'd always felt at home on a stage having a theological conversation like the one we were having that day. But as scholarly words and phrases like that, coupled with confident erudition, danced in the conference air, I had only two words in my head. Who cares? For me, this intellectual dissection of God's unmerited favor fell flat. No pulse, no blood, lifeless. At that time, I was waking up every day struggling to come up with a reason to keep living. Nobody really knew, but I was dying inside. Dying. Sad, lost, hopeless, unknown, wanting to be seen, but also wanting to run and hide, racked with guilt and shame and regret. So I couldn't have cared less about what we were talking about on stage that day. While that discussion may have stirred the neurons in the room, it never came within a mile of my busted heart. I'm not saying that what was discussed about grace wasn't accurate or factual, because it was, but it wasn't helpful. The conversation was smart, but not comforting. Something was missing. The form was there, but not the substance. The facts, but not the truth. And it's the truth that I was looking for that day. It's the truth we're all looking for. A watershed moment for me? Yes, it wasn't some one and done grand swoop because I would continue to work out that kind of salvation with fear and trembling in the months and years to come. But on that day, on that stage, I promised God that if given opportunities, I'd spend what was left of my life being a friend to sinners, of whom I was chief. If given the chance to preach, I'd preach one sermon, grace straight, no chaser, to one audience, the publicans and tax collectors, the screw-ups, misfits, liars, cheats, gypsies, tramps, and thieves. And this is that. This is it. I was thinking about that as I was looking forward to this weekend and writing those words this week, that this is so much more than this. This is God making good on a promise. And there was a long time there where I didn't believe God was making good on any promises to me at all. And so for all the people that have helped to make this happen, and I think very specifically about Reagan Troshan in particular, who directed this whole thing and has worked tirelessly behind the scenes, thank you. This is a gift to me, and to be able to share the platform with people who have changed my life, literally changed my life. Friends, non-blinking friends, who have stuck with me, who have not turned their face away when I was at my worst. It's a privilege. This has got redemption written all over it for me, and I am incredibly grateful. Okay, that's over. Now, I want to begin by reading Luke chapter 15. This is that chapter in the Gospel of Luke that tells three parables. Jesus tells three parables: the parable of the lost coin, the parable of the lost sheep, and the parable of the lost son, or the parable of the prodigal son. I'm not going to read the parable of the prodigal son, but the lost coin and the lost sheep. Beginning in verse 1, chapter 15 of Luke. Tax collectors and other notorious sinners often came to listen to Jesus teach. This made the Pharisees and teachers of religious law complain that he was associating with such sinful people, even eating with them. So Jesus told them this story. If a man has 100 sheep and one of them gets lost, what will he do? Won't he leave the 99 others in the wilderness and go to search for that one that is lost until he finds it? And when he has found it, he will joyfully carry it home on his shoulders. When he arrives, he will call together his friends and neighbors, saying, "Rejoice with me, because I have found my lost sheep." In the same way, there is more joy in heaven over one lost sinner who repents and returns to God than over 99 others who are righteous and haven't strayed away. Or suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Won't she light a lamp and sweep the entire house and search carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, she will call in her friends and neighbors and say, "Rejoice with me, because I have found my lost coin." In the same way, there is joy in the presence of God's angels, even when one sinner repents. I want to read a letter that I received a number of years ago from someone that I had never met. She said this: "So normally I don't go around messaging public figures, but after reading your The Life of an Amputee post, I'm making an exception. I've read a lot of your writings, but this one, wow, I still have tears running down my face from the accuracy of the imagery. This recently divorced pastor's daughter doesn't know if you could have expressed the anguish more powerfully than that. Thank you for showing up in your brokenness. Lost and broken Christians are nothing new, right? But a willing exposure in the midst of that is a whole different story, something we don't see much. Thank you." The anguish. She could have chosen any words or phrases, but she chose that phrase, the anguish, because pastors' daughters aren't supposed to get divorced, right? Until they do. Kind of like pastors aren't supposed to have affairs, right? Until they do. Kind of like you're not supposed to break things, right? Until you do, or you yourself are broken. Kind of like Christians aren't supposed to get way out there lost, right? Until they do. I used to think that the parables I just read to you, the parables of the lost sheep and the lost coin, were Jesus' way of describing how far Christians should go to reach people who aren't Christians. That's the way they were taught. They were parables of evangelism, that these parables are God's job description for us. That Jesus is describing the lengths that we should all go in order to reach non-Christians, that those of us who are found should go and pursue the lost. It's our job. It's our mandate. Reading them this way splits the world into two kinds of people: lost people and found people. The lost people are those who don't know God, and the found people are those who do. And while that's one way to sort of divvy up the human race, it also makes a very wrong-headed assumption that found people don't get lost, or that Christians have no need to be found. I'm convinced that we desperately need to rediscover the reality of Christian lostness. Because if we don't, then all we're left with when a Christian wanders off into the far country and gets lost is to doubt whether they were ever found in the first place. That's what we do. This assumption's made all the time. When I crashed and burned and bottomed out very publicly, very remarkably, in 2015, there was no shortage of basement bloggers wondering whether I was even a Christian. How could someone who is a Christian, someone who professes Jesus, how could they fall like this? How could they stumble and fall flat on their face like this? We make those assumptions all the time. We're evaluating perhaps where someone may be with God based on what we see. And if someone really blows it big, we conclude, well, they must not know God. Because someone who really knows God is getting better and better all the time, and this person's clearly getting worse. So they can't know God. It's impossible. These parables aren't about found people pursuing lost people like I thought. These parables are about God pursuing found people who get lost. That's what they're about. In other words, they're not about our pursuit of others, they're about God's pursuit of us. So to read the parables the way I had always understood them is to misread them. Because the fact is that even as Christians, we get lost all the time, all the time. Now, the text proves it because at one point, both the coin and the sheep were not lost. The coin was in the pocket, the sheep was in the pen. The very fact that the sheep wandered off and the coin was lost says that this found thing wandered off. It got lost, misplaced. So these aren't parables that are teaching us found people to go out and find the lost people. These are parables about God's pursuit of us found people who get lost. For example, we often get lost trying to find meaning and love and purpose apart from God. We may profess to be Christians and we know God and we know that God loves us, and yet we live as functional atheists every day, looking under every rock and behind every tree for things like meaning and purpose and security and love and acceptance and approval and all those sorts of things. We get lost in our dependence on people and things to save us from aloneness, insecurity, a sense of inadequacy. We get lost when hopes and dreams crash and burn. When one of our children goes off the deep end, when our parents get divorced, when our marriage fails, when she breaks up with you, when you don't get the job you want or get into the school that you want, we feel lost. We get lost in anger. We get lost in hurt. We get lost in bitterness. We get lost in pleasure seeking. We get lost in self-righteousness. We get lost in unforgiveness and pride and lust and selfishness and the thirst for credit, the need to be right, and so on and so forth. We get lost all the time. But I think the deepest lostness we experience is when our roles become our identity. For instance, many retired people that I've talked to describe a lostness of meaning now that their career is over. I've talked to a lot of retired people over the years, and for so long they had located their identity in the work that they did and all that came with it. And now that their role has changed, they experience a late in life identity crisis. I remember being in Santa Rosa, California a few years ago, and I was preaching on this idea of identity and how we tend to build our lives on a catalog of God replacements. And I was telling my story very openly, which I'll tell you a little bit more about here in a second. But some guy came up to me afterwards. He was probably in his mid-70s and said, I didn't experience what you experienced, but I now feel as lost as you felt then. And I'm in my mid-70s because I was a successful business guy. I would buy companies and break them off and sell them. I've got all the money that I could want. My family's intact, but for so long, I anchored my identity and my worth and my security and significance in the work that I did, and now that that work is over, I don't know who I am. I think I not only talking to retired people, but I also see this with parents when they become empty nesters. For so long, their identity was anchored in taking care of the kids. Now the kids have grown up and they've moved out of the house, and as a result, the parents have sort of lost their sense of purpose. They don't know who they are or what to do. Their role had become their identity. I could give you a handful of other examples, but when your roles become your identity, you experience new forms of lostness every time your role changes. And our roles change a lot over the course of our lives. As I mentioned, I lost everything in 2015. And in the words of Jimmy Buffett, I would simply have to say it was my own damn fault. I lost my marriage. I lost friendships. I lost my job. I lost credibility. I lost financial stability, hope, joy, opportunity. It was all gone overnight. Life as I knew it and life as I loved it was over. And I don't think we really know what it is we depend on to make life worth living until we lose it. I think when we lose something that we've been depending on to invest our lives with meaning and purpose and significance and security, and then that thing is gone, that's when we realize we turned it into a god. We turned it into something that didn't have the power to save us. I didn't realize it at the time, but my value, my security, my deepest sense of who I was, my identity was tethered to my roles. And ironically, I was preaching against this stuff and writing against this stuff all the time. And because my identity was tethered to my roles, when those roles vanished, I didn't just suffer grief and pain and loss. I began to suffer a severe identity crisis at 42 years old. Without the things I'd come to depend on to make me feel valuable and important, I no longer knew who I was. It wasn't just that I lost everything, I lost myself. Because my identity in my own mind, not in reality, but in my own mind, was tethered to my roles. I often say that the sanctuary, this place, is a recovery place masquerading as a church. And it is. I think that's probably the most accurate description of this place. I don't even really like calling it a church because I don't fit in church. And I certainly don't like calling myself a pastor because I don't fit that profile either. So the best way for me to describe whatever this is, whatever God's doing here, is it's a recovery place, a masquerading as a church. That's what the sanctuary is. But I need to explain that. So I want to say two things. First, when most of us hear the word recovery, we think of people in recovery programs for things like alcohol and drug use, anger management, sexual addiction, those sorts of things. But the truth is that we are all in recovery, all of us. We've all been hurt, we've been disappointed, we all have fears and insecurities, we've all felt unloved and rejected in some way, all of us. And therefore, we all have unhealthy relationships with something or someone that we depend on to soothe the pain, to make us feel strong, to make us feel less alone, in control, loved, important, safe, secure. So for instance, your addiction may not be alcohol, but it may be getting approval. It may be what other people think of you. You have effectively photoshopped your life so that people only see the best parts of who you are. That's an addiction too. Your addiction may not be getting high, but it may be getting respect. It may not be sex, but it may be getting attention for the way that you look or for your professional achievements. It may not be food, but it may be financial security. It may not be nicotine, but it may be success. So there's two types of people in this world: people in recovery who know that they are, and people in recovery who think that they're not. But there is no one who is not in recovery. We're all in, all of us. That's the first thing. Second thing, and this is important. This has been a bit of a paradigm shift for me in the last 3 or 4 months. Recovery does not mean getting fixed. When I was at my worst and I would pour out the depths of my distress to my dear friend Paul Zoll, he would always respond initially by saying, "Stick with that." Those 3 words, stick with that. I wasn't entirely sure what he meant by that at the time, but I know now what he meant was that there's so much to learn in the place of ruin, so much to see of God, so much to learn about yourself at the scene of pain and loss and regret and shame and fear. So much. So don't be so quick to look for a way out. Don't be so quick to try and fix it. Stick with it. You remember that? We tend to make a god out of getting fixed. We also tend to make a god out of fixing other people. We love that stuff. We tend to idolize things like progressing beyond hard places. We idolize that stuff. And in the process, we miss out on something so essential. Something so essential. So what if real progress isn't what they told us it is? What if real progress is a growing awareness of our need for help? What if that's what it is? What if real progress is a deepening deconstruction of our burdensome and delusional sense of self-sufficiency? What if that's what progress is? It's not what they told us it is. Not so much about the heights we should attain, but about acknowledging the depth of our need. What if that's what true growth was? What if getting better has more to do with accepting our limitations, finally taking off the masks we wear and being honest about our unfixedness, telling the truth about ourselves? What if real recovery is marked by a growing acceptance of the fact that in this life anyway, we will never fully recover? And accepting that we can be healed in this life, but not whole. What if life isn't about getting out of hard places, but discovering God in them? What if life is less about God picking us up when we fall, as much as it is about God curling up on the bathroom floor with us? I was being interviewed a couple weeks ago, and enjoyable conversation, enjoyable interview. As a podcast, and as I was telling my story, the host said, "Isn't it really kind of God to pick us up when we fall?" And I really like this guy, but I thought he may needed to be gently corrected, so I just kind of redirected the conversation a bit. And I said, I think that is something very sweet, but I think it's even sweeter than that. I think it's so sweet and so true that when we fall, we discover God on the ground with us. He's there. I mean, what's the incarnation if it's not that? The second person of the Trinity taking on human flesh and frailties and dwelling among us? What's the cross if it's not that? God curled up on the bathroom floor with us. What is the cross? What is the incarnation if it's not that? God on the ground. God in the ruins with us. Not because his intention is always to pull us out, but to prove himself faithful in that stuff. To prove that he truly is a God of comfort in it. Not, I'm getting out of it, I'm growing past it, I'm getting better and better. You know, one of the things that I grew up, not from my mom, I didn't hear this. Every time I say, I grew up hearing the wrong thing, my mom's like, I didn't teach you that. I'm like, I didn't say you, but it was the Christian schools you sent me to. They did teach it. But I sort of grew up with this impression that real growth was I'm getting stronger and stronger and more competent every day. That once I become a Christian, I may have a few flub-ups here and there, but overall I'm getting better and better. Then life happens, like Steve was talking about. And when real life happens, betterment usually doesn't. And so I just concluded that Christianity must not be for me. If Christianity is for good people who have their lives together and who are faithful and devoted and committed and they say no to all the bad things and yes to all the good things, well, that doesn't describe me, so I'm out. Exit stage left. But then as I got older and actually started reading what God himself had to say about growth, there's a very interesting chapter in Philippians, Paul's letter to the churches in Philippi, chapter 3, where he talks about where he started and how his growth was downward. So he says things like this, man, I was the religious bomb. I mean, I in terms of my religious resume, I was strong. When it came to the law, I was perfect. I mean, I had it all. I nailed it. This religious thing, I nailed it. I was educated in it. I kept all the rules. I jumped through all the hoops. I crossed all the T's. I dotted all the I's. I nailed it. There was no one who was more religious than me. Started top, strong. And he said, over the course of my life, God just systematically deconstructed that nonsense. So now I'm at the end of my life going, I'm the worst person I know, the chief of sinners, but I have a faithful God who has adopted me and will never let me go. So maybe Christian growth, or growth in general, isn't starting low and getting high. Maybe it's starting high and going low. Maybe that's it. Maybe the trajectory isn't what they told us it was. The trajectory isn't this way, it's that way. So maybe real recovery is just a growing awareness of our own need. Maybe real growth is just this growing deconstruction of this delusional sense of self-sufficiency that we develop over the course of our lives. So what if life really isn't about conquering the hard places? Maybe that's not what this is about. Maybe that's why a lot of people sort of bail on God, because they've been taught that this is all about victory and conquering and getting better and improving. And the more realistic ones, as they get older, realize this isn't happening for me. If this is who God loves, I'm out. Maybe it's not what they told us it was. Maybe life isn't about getting out of those places, but like I said, discovering God in them. It's not so much about God picking us up when we fall as it is about God meeting us on the ground. There's another parable in Luke 15, probably the most famous parable Jesus told. The parable of the Prodigal Son. Greg Garrett wrote this about the late Brennan Manning. He said, Brennan resonated so profoundly with the parable of the prodigal son because Brennan had plenty of wandering on his ledger. Gosh, I love that line. I mean, don't we all have plenty of wandering on our ledger? He went on, like many of us, Brennan knew what it felt like to stray, to slip into mires of our own making, to wish we could go home. Like many of us, he knew what it felt like to think you are unworthy, that you've worn out your welcome, and that there is no home left at home. But Jesus' story of the son who insulted his father by demanding his inheritance while his father was still living, who shamed his father by blowing through that inheritance with wine and women until nothing was left, is a story of the purest grace and of a love that will never write us off, ever. Two things I've learned very acutely over the last 8 years are this. Number one, you are capable of getting lost and failing in a way that is unthinkable to you right now. Unthinkable. I lived it, I know. And I know lots of other people have lived it too. You are capable of failing and getting lost in a way that right now is unthinkable to you. That's the first thing. The second thing is this: God's love and forgiveness are big enough to cover the fact that your greatest failure may be ahead of you. I found that really hard to believe. When I was in the mires of my own failure, like, really? Is God's love and forgiveness big enough to cover this mess that I've made? See, the bad news is that you will keep wandering off. My friend David Zoll, who is Paul and Mary Zoll's middle son, wrote a book recently that came out this fall called Low Anthropology. It's actually a phrase that Paul coined. Low anthropology. Having low expectations of human beings. Banking on the fact that sinners are going to sin, liars are going to lie, broken people are going to break things, and fallen people are going to fall down. And when we don't have a low anthropology, horizontally speaking, we begin to expect people to be bigger and better than they are. And when they prove to be human, we're aghast. My friend Pat Thurmer, who you'll hear from tomorrow, said, I've been in the church for over 60 years, and I'm still a bit dumbfounded at why we get so scandalized. The last institution in the whole world that still believes in the concept of original sin is so scandalized when they actually encounter it. Why? High anthropology is the enemy. Expecting people to be more than they are. So, as scary as it may sound, your greatest failure may be in front of you. And when at that moment, it may seem like it's over, it's done, I've finally been found out, the cat's out of the bag, the you know what has hit the fan, I'm done, I'm out. And even if people leave and wander off and they abandon you, you'll discover in those moments, and this is one of the reasons why I think God allows us to wander the way that he does, because he, in those moments, proves to be the primary faithful friend. It's really, really difficult, as you've heard me say before perhaps, to know who your friends are when you're at the top and you have so much to offer. But when you're at the bottom and all you have to offer people around you is leprosy and liability, you discover pretty quick who your real friends are. And the best friend you will discover in those dark moments is God. He's the one who, your fall may have surprised others. Your failure may surprise others. It doesn't surprise him. So the bad news is that you will keep wandering off. You'll keep getting lost. But the good news is that God never gets tired of finding you, ever, and bringing you home, ever. He meets you in all of your meandering 70 times 7. 70 times 7. When we foolishly run off, the good shepherd joyfully comes after us, picks us up, puts us over his shoulders, and carries us home. Every freaking time. Every time. He meets our guilt with his grace and our messiness with his mercy and our failures with his faithfulness every time. Every time. His pursuant love is mugging in nature. Mugging. Thankfully. So your stubborn propensity, my stubborn propensity for getting lost, it doesn't annoy God. Okay, it doesn't. It doesn't annoy God. It doesn't throw him off. In fact, it gives him an opportunity to do what he loves to do. Find you again and again and again. At no point in these parables does this stupid sheep who wanders off, at no point does the shepherd go far. He's like, I got to leave these behind. What's going to happen? They're probably going to run off because they're all so stupid. I'm going to go find this one. Does he get there? He's like, come on, man. You've done this 4 times this week. I mean, my gosh, you realize what you're possibly costing me by coming after you because you're so stupid and so stubborn, and now I'm leaving the 99 back. It's not the way the shepherd responds. He finds him and he's smiling. He delights in the fact that he's found them, and he picks him up and he puts him over his shoulder and he carries him home. Same with the lost coin that gets lost. Your stubborn propensity for getting lost doesn't annoy God. It doesn't throw him off. He expects it, okay? God has a low anthropology when it comes to you and me. He expects it. So no matter where you go, how far you run, or how stubborn your roaming may be, he will never stop coming for you with infinite amounts of gritty grace and ferocious forgiveness. Never. Never. My theological, and I would also say probably literary hero is a man by the name of Robert Capen, who died a number of years ago. He was a bit of a ragamuffin himself, and he sums up these 2 parables poetically. parable of the lost coin and the parable of the lost son. He sums them up poetically when he writes this. The entire cause of the recovery operation in both stories is the shepherd's and the woman's determination to find the lost. Neither the lost sheep nor the lost coin does a blessed thing except hang around in its lostness. On the strength of these parables alone, and this is a line I love, and it's controversial, which makes me love it even more, but he says, on the strength of these parables alone, it is clear that it is our sins and not our goodnesses that most commend us to the grace of God. Man, we get that wrong. Gosh, we get that wrong. We think for some reason that it's our goodnesses that summon God's grace. It is your need, your mess, your sinfulness that summons God's grace, summons it. These parables of lostness are emphatically not stories designed to convince us that if we will wind ourselves up to some acceptable level of moral and or spiritual improvement, that God will then forgive us. Rather, they are parables about God's determination to move before we do. In short, to make lostness the only ticket we need to the supper of the Lamb. Whew! Man, I love that. What do you bring to the table? Lostness, screwed upness. Whether that screwed upness is making a cataclysmic and very public mistake like me, sinning like I did, or if your lostness is just you thinking you're better than me because you haven't done it. Both are lost. The younger brother who broke all the rules is lost, and the older brother who kept all the rules and thought he was better than the younger brother is equally lost. Equally lost. It's not just the parable of one lost son, it's the parable of two lost sons. One was lost in his rule breaking, and the other was lost in his rule keeping. But whichever way you tend to get lost, lostness is the only ticket you need. It is all of grace. Everything, top to bottom, beginning to end. People will come, people will go. God sticks. He stays. Never blinks, never bails. Let's pray.